welcome everyone. Good morning, and welcome to the Quentin Skinner Lecture and Symposium of 2022. We are truly delighted to welcome Dr. Isaac Nakhimovsky from Yale University, who will speak to us today on the most liberal of all ideas, the political thought of the Holy Alliance. This is a long-awaited and eagerly anticipated event on a subject that I think we can all agree has only become more timely. But before I fully introduce Isaac, let me say something about the Quentin Skinner Lectureship, which is the distinguished position that Isaac currently holds. In 2009, Quentin Skinner, whom we're very pleased to have here today, generously established an annual lectureship in modern intellectual history since 1500, based on his award for the 2006 Balzan Prize for Political Thought. The Balzan Skinner Scholar held a visiting fellowship at CRASSH for one term during the academic year and presented the Balzan Skinner Lecture and participated in the related symposium during their academic year of attendance. Now, since 2016, the fellowship has been known as the Quentin Skinner Lectureship in Intellectual History. Like the Balzan Skinner Fellow, the Quentin Skinner Lecturer delivers a public address based on their current research and organizes and participates in a related symposium that brings together scholars of different parts of their careers. Past occupants of this position have been Emma Hunter, Avi Lifshitz, Sophie Smith, Teresa Bejan, Anna Becker, Karuna Mantena, Gabrielle Paquette, Tim Stanton, Joel Isaac, and Hannah Dawson. Now, it's a very great pleasure to introduce this year's lecturer, Isaac Nakhimovsky. Isaac is Associate Professor of History and the Humanities at Yale University, and I have no doubt is well known to many here today. After completing his undergraduate degree at Harvard College, Isaac went on to do an MPhil in political thought here at Cambridge as a Gates Scholar. He then received his PhD in political science at Harvard, and then returned to Cambridge as a research fellow before he began teaching at Yale in 2014. Now, Isaac's work ranges across the modern history of political thought, from Vattel and Fichte to Lukács and Gunnar Myrdal. And now this range, I think, is not only a testament to the breadth of Isaac's intellectual ambition, but also to the way that his work has continually sought to show how new ways of comprehending 18th and 19th century international political thought provides the keys to unlocking 20th century thinkers like Schmidt, Myrdal, and Lukács, and the history of international and global order more broadly. In his landmark book, The Closed Commercial State, Perpetual Peace and Commercial Society from Rousseau to Fichte, Isaac provides a new reading of Fichte's political thought that locates his argument about national economic self-sufficiency in the context of aspirations to extricate European states from their self-destructive rivalries, and in 17th and 18th century debates about global commerce and the problem of inequality. This work, together with a new edition of Fichte's address to the German nation that Isaac published with his collaborators in 2013, thoroughly revises received accounts of the relationship between cosmopolitanism and nationalism, internationalism and nationalism in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And in doing so, they cast new light on the vision of international order underlying the project of achieving national self-sufficiency in the 20th century. Isaac's two celebrated co-edited volumes of essays on 18th century political thought and its post-revolutionary legacies, Commerce and Peace in the Enlightenment from 2017, and Markets, Morals, Politics, Jealousy of Trade and the History of Political Thought from 2018, show how the diversity and depth of debates about peace and political economy in the 18th century explode the governing typologies that dominate the contemporary study of politics and international relations. In his current project, some of which I believe we will be hearing today, Isaac excavates the political thought of the Holy Alliance, one of the contenders for reordering the world in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, a history that promises once again to illuminate 20th and 21st century debates about international relations and to challenge inherited and ultimately limiting understandings of the possibilities for global politics. So please join me in welcoming Isaac.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. Thank you all, especially this should start with Michelle Nakhimovsky at CRASSH for organizing this event not just once, but 3 times since 2020. Thank you, Michelle. And also to Chris Mextroth, Mir Siegelberg, and Richard Burke for doing the same in the history faculty, and to all the participants in the symposium this afternoon. And additional thanks to Richard Burke for stepping in at the very last moment when Natasha Wheatley unfortunately couldn't be here. So the work I'm going to present today began to take shape in 2016 when I realized that the topic of my previous book, The Post-Commercial State, had suddenly acquired a new resonance. It was about the social contract and the division of labor. It was about a certain German philosopher during the French Revolution, and how around the year 1800 he began to reframe a whole set of 18th century debates about trade and finance and economic independence and so on. And then all of a sudden it turned out that I had written a book about the political theory of Brexit. And here we are again, and I'm giving a lecture on the Holy Alliance, which is about federal constitutionalism and national sovereignty, but it's also about big states and small states. It's also about Russia and Europe, and the fact that I'm giving this lecture in 2022 rather than 2020 means that once again the topic's taken on a bit of unanticipated weight. And so all I wanted to say was I trust it's clear this is not my intention, but that world history has just been playing a lot of tricks with my research agenda. Okay. So by the revolutions of 1848, the Holy Alliance had become a byword for reaction. Looking back, the Italian patriot Giuseppe Mazzini declared, "The masters of the world had united against the future." The Treaty of the Holy Alliance was originally announced in 1815 by Alexander I of Russia, and it had come to encompass everyone who had joined the Tsar in his reactionary conspiracy. Mazzini promised that sooner or later this conspiracy would fail, liberalism would triumph, and the future would belong to the democratic nation-state. The Holy Alliance is still remembered along these lines, but Holy Alliances are not exclusively encountered in the past. The Holy Alliance became and remained a rhetorical weapon aimed against threats to national sovereignty, against entrenched barriers to the assertion of political agency. The historical specificity of this label enabled it to perform a function also served by various episodes in the French Revolution of 1789, such as the Terror. That is, to deploy historical analogies whose moral force derives from the exceptional character imputed to the original case. Today, I'm going to approach the Holy Alliance from a very different vantage point, and that is the perspective of contemporary liberals who initially welcomed the proclamation of the Holy Alliance in 1815. So in the first instance, my aim is to render intelligible a set of political judgments that are missing from Mazzini's story and that still seem wildly implausible in hindsight. And that is why the proclamation of the Holy Alliance was initially welcomed by these contemporary liberals as an emancipatory project. The Holy Alliance was declared to be the most liberal of all ideas by a former professor of logic and metaphysics at the University of Königsberg, not Immanuel Kant, who had died in 1804, but his immediate follower, the self-proclaimed liberal Wilhelm Traugott Krug. Krug was joined by a wide variety of other liberals, not only in Germany, but also in Britain, in France, Denmark, Switzerland, Poland, and even New England, who did not see a reactionary past in the Holy Alliance, but a liberal future. They could see this liberal future because the Holy Alliance initially registered as an implementation of 18th century ideas about constitutional reform, prosperity, and peace. Liberal hopes could be invested in the Holy Alliance because of arguments made by a series of 18th century writers following Voltaire about the rise of Russia. They had identified a historical process that was turning Russia into a force for universal emancipation, capable of fundamentally transforming the behavior of European states and empires. In 18th century terms, they had fashioned Russia into an ami des hommes, a friend of humanity. The Holy Alliance linked this strategy for bringing about perpetual peace to an expression of Christianity that resonated across the Protestant world, including in circles associated with the emerging Anglo-American movements to abolish slavery and war. So I should emphasize that the point of reconstructing these ideas here is not to tell a story about how the Holy Alliance failed to realize its ideals. On the contrary, the point is to explain how anyone could possibly have formed a liberal idea of the Holy Alliance in the first place. The reasons they did turn out not only to be intelligible, but to overlap in significant ways with more familiar expressions of liberalism. And that makes the Holy Alliance a promising site for investigating a revealing disjuncture between expectations and experience. The various hopes and fears projected onto Russia after 1815 and aroused by it may be as unedifying a source of information about Russia itself as Friedrich Engels once claimed. So Engels wrote, "Once again, Europe was befooled in an incredible fashion. To the princes and the reactionaries, Tsardom preached legitimacy and the maintaining of the status quo. To the liberal Philistine, the deliverance of oppressed nations, and both believed it." But such projections, then as now, can reveal a great deal about the projectors, about what they believe as well as what they prefer to hear, at home as well as abroad. The first history of liberalism was published by Professor Krug in 1823, and it's still cited by historians of liberalism. But the fact that Krug's history culminated with the Holy Alliance as what he called the most liberal of all ideas seems to have been overlooked by more recent contributions to that genre. Any history of liberalism that omits the most liberal of all ideas seems to be incomplete on its own terms. But the rest of this lecture is not going to be a history of liberalism. Instead, it's going to be a history of the questions that the Holy Alliance posed for contemporary liberals. Questions in the sense of dense aggregations of problems to be solved, like the social question or the Jewish question. So in other words, this is going to be a history of what might be called the Holy Alliance question. To what extent was it possible to legalize the external as well as internal relations of the state, to make international politics constitutional? And what sort of European or global economy did such a politics presuppose? In France, the post-war settlement of 1815 could be seen as the elimination of a revolutionary aberration or a regression to a reactionary past. But it could also be seen as an initial stage in the emergence of a liberal future. The Holy Alliance projected these possibilities onto a supranational stage. Did the post-war settlement just represent one form of domination succeeding another? Did it portend the decline and fall of modern Europe, collapsing through internal divisions only to be overrun by Russian armies? Or did the appearance of the Holy Alliance present an opportunity for genuine emancipation and reconciliation, and perhaps the birth of a federal Europe? By 1848, for Mazzini and many of his contemporaries, these questions had acquired definitive answers. For Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the Holy Alliance represented a broad consensus against revolutionary change, a consensus extending from liberals, like the French historian and politician François Guizot, to the conservatives like the Austrian statesman Clemens von Metternich. All were aligned, of course, against the specter that, in the famous words of the Communist Manifesto, was haunting Europe. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals, and German police spies. But understanding why a Holy Alliance could be seen as emancipatory in the first place calls for a new history of the liberal idea of the Holy Alliance. And that is a history of utilitarians and evangelicals, political economists and abolitionists, French and English radicals, and German philosophers. This is a history that begins in the Enlightenment, but points ahead to the so-called new Holy Alliances that were often detected during the 20th century, from the League of Nations through the Cold War. So in the rest of this lecture, I'm going to introduce this history through a survey of some early visual representations of the Holy Alliance, Then I'll show why the Holy Alliance could be recognized as a version of a political strategy that was extensively theorized in the 18th century as a kind of federal politics shaped by international public opinion. And finally, I'll turn to this proliferation of historical analogies to the Holy Alliance through the 20th century. Instead of adding to them myself, I intend to use them as a map for tracking how the problems which the liberal idea of the Holy Alliance had attempted to address have continued to reappear in new forms under new circumstances. So when the Holy Alliance first appeared, it was not seen as the dead weight of the past. It was a site for many different political futures. Some of those futures were apocalyptic, but others were redemptive. Some were redemptive through the state, others from the state. Some were national in scope, or others international or even universal. And finally, the future of the Holy Alliance was also liberal. Okay, so this is the apocalypse of the Holy Alliance, which appears in a pair of engravings by George Cruikshank. They accompanied an 1821 pamphlet by the radical satirist William Hone, which was dedicated to what Hone called the visible and invisible members of the Holy Alliance. The pamphlet was occasioned by the Austrian military intervention in Naples to suppress its new liberal constitution. It was also prompted by controversies connected to the coronation of George IV. Hone asserted not only an equivalence, but outright collusion between the corruption of the British political establishment and the suppression of liberty abroad by the Holy Alliance. The captions to Cruikshank's engravings cobbled together various quotations and misquotations from Shakespeare, ending with, "Iron for Naples, hid with English gilt," G-I-L-T. On the left is a bishop anointing a heavily armed king. The illustration on the right shows the Holy Alliance as what's called a composite caricature, a popular form depicting people as assemblages of the objects they worked with. Conspiring monarchs are composed of instruments of death. The Holy Alliance appears as an automaton of armaments, crowned with a halo of daggers, putting Naples to fire and sword. Here's how this apparition was described by the radical critic Leigh Hunt. The body is a mortar, the thighs and arms fetters, happily linked like bones. The legs have black cannon for boots, and the head, surmounted with a crown, is a cannonball or a block. Choose which you will. The machine is gifted with a monstrous vitality and is in the act of swinging its sword in a furious manner at the tree of liberty. Hunt went on to compare this machine to the figure of Talus, the fearsome iron creature serving as the squire of the Knight of Justice in Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queene. And he invited Hone to produce a sequel that would bring to life another machine capable of defending liberty from the technology of despotism, namely the printing press. Or as Hone described it, that new iron creature which contains in itself the mind as well as the force of thousands, and has arisen in these romantic times to put down the brute force that masks itself in human shape. Perhaps what Hunt had in mind was something like Victor Hugo's "Ceci tuera cela," this will kill that, referring to the printing press on the one hand and the Gothic cathedral on the other. It was the power of public opinion and the power to communicate it that offered the possibility of redemption from the apocalypse unleashed by the Holy Alliance. But from another perspective, it was the Holy Alliance itself that held out the prospect of redemption from the apocalypse that had been unleashed by the French Revolution. Here's the redemptive Holy Alliance that appears in an 1815 work by the German artist Heinrich Olivier. It shows the three initial signatories of the Treaty of the Holy Alliance, the Emperor of Russia, the Emperor of Austria, and the King of Prussia, three knights of justice, as it were, standing in a Gothic cathedral and appealing to God as witness to their vow of brotherhood. But this is not a static or monolithic idea of restoration. In fact, it points to a variety of views of redemption through the state and also of redemption from the state. On the one hand, the artist was connected to the philosopher Friedrich Schlegel and the hope of unifying Germany under a revived imperial constitution. The painting was inspired by an Austrian literary work imagining this scene at Frankfurt Cathedral, which is where Holy Roman Emperors were crowned. But that vision was, of course, contested in Prussia, where the monarchy appropriated the Holy Alliance in service of its sweeping new interventions in religious life, aiming to consolidate Prussia's identity as a unified Protestant state. When the liberal theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher complained that the new liturgy of the unified Prussian church contained no prayer for the German Federation, the official response was to add a prayer to the Holy Alliance instead. And this prayer remained in the Prussian liturgy until 1895. In Russia, too, the Holy Alliance was associated with a new state-imposed religious establishment. Like Prussia's, it was inspired by a Napoleonic model, and it briefly placed all Christian confessions on equal footing with the Orthodox Church. For many liberals who embraced the Holy Alliance, it was the evangelical spirituality of the new Russian Bible Society, founded on the model of the British and Foreign Bible Society, that represented the holy in the Holy Alliance. From another perspective, though, the Holy Alliance did not represent redemption through the state, but deliverance from its centralizing power, including its assertion of control over religious life. The painter was a childhood friend of the Gerlach family, who were fierce opponents of absolutism in both its royal and revolutionary forms. The Gerlachs were prominent aristocratic critics of the statist logic that was shared by the bureaucratic reformers who served the Prussian monarchy and the liberals who hoped to tame it with representative institutions. After 1848, Leopold von Gerlach's label for the real alternative to this relentless centralization of state power was the politics of the Holy Alliance. So the future of the Holy Alliance could be redemptive as well as apocalyptic, and the scope of that redemption could also be national or international. The more narrowly national Holy Alliance appears in this engraving from Nuremberg titled The Holy Alliance, or Victory Celebration of October 18, 1814, which was the first annual commemoration of the Battle of Leipzig, the so-called Battle of Nations against Napoleon. So this heavenly trinity features a Germanic Hercules, a guise in which Martin Luther had been portrayed using his club to slay the Hydra of the Roman Church. And below are the victors, but this time the three allied kings are not alone. They're surrounded by their generals and their armies, all arrayed around a stone altar presided over by a cleric, possibly Luther himself. So this is a Holy Alliance closely associated with military victory and the popular mobilization that had achieved it. Interestingly, this has been dated to 1814, which might be incorrect since news of the Holy Alliance didn't appear in Germany until the beginning of 1816. But there were two sources of the term Holy Alliance that were frequently referenced in 1814, which were both popular within the Tsar's religious circle and also among a wide variety of Protestants. One was the Book of Daniel. The other was The Adventures of Telemachus, the early 18th century epic by the Archbishop Fénelon. An international Holy Alliance appears in this French engraving of 1817, which is titled The Holy Alliance Placed Under the Protection of Religion by the Tutelary Angels of the Allied Powers. As the inscription makes a point of specifying, the Treaty of the Holy Alliance had been concluded in Paris. It was signed privately in September 1815 by two of the wartime allies of the Tsar, the King of Prussia and the Emperor of Austria, and in November by the newly restored King of France. Alexander then published the treaty in St. Petersburg together with a public manifesto he issued on Christmas Day. This is not a militaristic Holy Alliance. Unlike the previous engraving, the only weaponry remaining in this engraving is the sword of justice, the top left. In 1817, the armies of Russia, Prussia, and Austria were still occupying France, but here they are represented by angels offering up the text of the treaty, and they're now assisted by the angelic representatives of the restored Bourbon monarchies of France and Spain. At the very top is a series of rondels listing some of the other states, notably including even neutral and republican Switzerland, that had formally acceded to the Holy Alliance over the course of 1816 and 1817. There's a conspicuously blank rundle at the top, just as there's an Allied power conspicuously missing from the bottom. Britain was the only European state, apart from the Pope, that never acceded to the Holy Alliance. And for many liberals, and not just French ones, the Holy Alliance was an opportunity to realize ideals that Napoleon had betrayed, but that Britain had monopolized for itself. So the Holy Alliance as a liberal future is represented on the cover of this remarkable publication, The Archive of the Holy Alliance, which appeared in Munich in 1818 and 1819. The Holy Alliance that appears on its front cover is strikingly impersonal. There's no trace of the original three signatories, the Emperor of Russia, Emperor of Austria, King of Prussia. Instead, the abstraction of this emblem points toward the kind of liberal theology embraced by many liberals at the time, like Benjamin Constant. It suggests an abstract vision of progress as the realization of humanity's moral potential. This was the vision of progress developed by Wilhelm Traugott Krug, who resembled Constant in many ways and who figured prominently in the archive. The cover of the archive shows a Roman fasces within a ring of stars at the center of a glory of divine light, the technology of the state, the instruments of force bound up in legal authority, now infused with providential purpose and transformed into an ethical whole. Krug drew on Kant in order to identify the Holy Alliance with the ideal of an ethical community whose universality transcended the divisions of a pluralistic world of independent states. From this perspective, the Holy Alliance did not reflect the individuality of its founders, but the progress of Christianity. As one contributor to the archive put it, the fundamentally political Protestantism of the Holy Alliance was the successor to the confessions of faith of the Protestant Reformation and also to the Declaration of Rights of the French Revolution. Or as another contributor to the archive put it, the idea expressed in the Holy Alliance resides in millions of heads and hearts. The aim of the archive was to collect contemporary responses to the Holy Alliance, together with public documents, so that both contemporaries and posterity would be able to form a balanced judgment of this world historical moment. It seems to have been entirely neglected by posterity, but it did catch the attention of at least one French contemporary. In 1823, the Baron Bignon attacked the archive for conjuring up what he called an imaginary world of the Holy Alliance. While the German philosophers had lost themselves in their ideals, the Congress of Verona had exposed what Bignon called the reality of the Holy Alliance. So the reality of the Holy Alliance in 1823 is represented in this famous satire of the Congress of Verona. So after the Austrian intervention in Naples, the Allies had met again in 1822 to discuss another intervention against the liberal constitution of Spain. And the possibility of further interventions loomed, perhaps even to restore Spanish rule in the Americas. This scene illustrates the post-war continuation of Ancien Regime power politics. The conference table is split one way by the British reaction to French aggression, and the other way by the Austrian reaction to Russian expansionism. Alexander is on the left, gesturing towards a map of Spain, while the Austrian emperor eyes him warily from across the table. And behind the Austrian emperor is Metternich, saying, "Take care of that bear. He has set his mind on blood, and his voracious appetite will gorge both east and west. And he is only making you his tools to cut each other's throats, that he may devour you all the more easily." So from one perspective, then, this is the political reality, masked by the imaginary world of liberal ideas. But from another perspective, it is actually the emancipatory politics of the Holy Alliance that was being made into a tool of Metternich's reactionary politics. Metternich's verdict that the Holy Alliance was a loud-sounding nothing has been repeated for generations, together with the description of his English counterpart, Lord Castlereagh, that it was a piece of sublime mysticism and nonsense. Actually, Metternich and Castlereagh had both intervened to change both the form and the content of Alexander's treaty. On the one hand, they redefined the treaty as a purely personal expression of the Tsar's eccentric religious sentiments, rather than a public declaration of political principles. And on the other hand, Metternich also changed the actual text of the Tsar's draft. He turned what was originally described as a union of peoples into a union of princes, and he turned what was originally expressed as a commitment to the future, based on a condemnation of the past, into a commitment to securing the present. But these interventions were only partly successful. Metternich's revisions did appear in the text of the published treaty, but not in the public manifesto that Alexander published along with it. The manifesto reproduced the sense of the original draft, and the two texts were encountered and interpreted together by everyone outside the hidden process of diplomacy. For some liberals, like Germain de Staël, the Russian emperor's association with so-called religious mystics had not produced nonsense, it had produced an expression of the kind of religious sentiments that she had identified as the moral foundation for liberal politics. And for some liberals, the Holy Alliance was not empty of political content, but a familiar kind of political act, a kind of politics with emancipatory potential. This was the perspective of two patriots with long-standing connections to Russia, Frédéric César de la Harpe, a former Swiss revolutionary who had served as the Russian emperor's tutor, and Adam Czartoryski, a former Polish revolutionary who became his foreign minister. Both La Harpe and Czartoryski were critical of the Holy Alliance itself, especially La Harpe. But at the end of the 1820s, both La Harpe and Czartoryski still defended the Holy Alliance from fellow liberals by distinguishing what La Harpe called the initial conception from the subsequent development of the Holy Alliance. The best illustration of this liberal initial conception of the Holy Alliance is this 1803 print by Isaac Cruikshank. Here, the Russian emperor appears as an actual bear, serving as mediator between Britain and France, saying, "I wonder you civilized folks could not agree upon matters without reference to me, whom you have ridiculed as a barbarian." The civilized folks are not so civilized themselves. The bear is making peace between John Bull, who's an actual bull, and Napoleon, who's a monkey. The act of mediation caricatured in this print could be described as a passing moment of no real consequence in the diplomatic history of the Napoleonic Wars. But the act shown here also represents a form of politics extensively discussed and theorized in London and Paris from the 1780s onwards. And the fact that it was being practiced by a Russian bear was a vindication of a thought first voiced by Voltaire, who declared in 1771 that enlightenment comes to us from the north. After Alexander took power in 1801, and again after Napoleon's defeat in Russia in 1812, La Harpe and Czartoryski both tried to achieve constitutional change in their own countries by mobilizing their many contacts in Paris and London to guide Russian intervention in European politics. Among these contacts were the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham, the French Republican political economist Jean-Baptiste Say, and the American statesman Thomas Jefferson. Their assignment was to turn this Russian intervention into a transformative moment, not just for European politics, but for the political and economic relations of the entire Atlantic world. The geographic scope and imaginative potential of this type of politics and its recurring association with Russia is illustrated by this 1813 American reworking of Cruikshank's original. John Bull is the real beast in this one. Napoleon's been replaced by Columbia, who's saying, "I thank you, Mr. Bruin, but I cannot trust the bull," until he's retracted his horns, or in other words, agreed to free trade for American shipping. For Jefferson and other Americans, the result of Russian intervention could be a new system of international law enshrining the principle of free trade. For British abolitionists like William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson, it was the universal abolition of the slave trade. For liberals like La Harpe, Czartoryski, and Krug, it was all of these, but also the introduction of liberal constitutions and representative institutions throughout Europe. Of course, political experience after 1815 diverged from most of these liberal expectations, except perhaps for one case. As La Harpe later wrote, English diplomacy never intervened in Switzerland except to restore the patricians of the old regime. The Swiss people owes it to Russia alone that the Federal Pact contains the seeds of liberalism. Okay, let me now turn to the sources of what La Harpe called the initial conception of the Holy Alliance. La Harpe's efforts to liberate Switzerland through Russian intervention show why the Holy Alliance could be recognized as a performance of Enlightenment politics. It was a politics premised on the communication of private understandings, which were expected to issue in public actions. And Czartoryski's efforts to liberate Poland through Russian intervention show why the Holy Alliance could be recognized as a stage in a legislative process, as a form of constitutional politics formally theorized by 18th century authorities on the law of nations, as well as the public law of the Holy Roman Empire. Considering the Holy Alliance in this way turns a minor diplomatic anomaly into a central episode in a broader history of political thought. La Harpe's efforts hinged on his attempts to conclude a kind of alliance between the Russian emperor and what he called the civilized world. La Harpe's strategy was to enlist liberals in the project of developing and populating the Russian Empire. But as they enhanced the capacities of the Russian state, Alexander's allies would also be assuming the function of an international public opinion. They would be authorizing as well as guiding Alexander's interventions. By cultivating this alliance with Alexander, liberals would be enlisting Russian prestige and power as a tool against their own entrenched political establishments, which no longer met the changing needs of society and which had remained impervious to internal pressure. La Harpe's correspondence with Alexander documents the rhetorical strategies and literary techniques that he used to practice this kind of politics. One example is a meeting La Harpe held in 1802 with the British lawyer and future Lord Chancellor Thomas Erskine. La Harpe showed Erskine a private letter that Alexander had written to him, in which he declared his private Republican sentiments. And then, in a scene from a sentimental novel, Erskine was brought to tears by the letter, and the weeping cemented a new alliance. La Harpe then deputized Erskine as what he called an independent and philanthropic statesman, who had the confidence of the Prince Regent of Great Britain, as La Harpe had the confidence of the Emperor of Russia. Until now, this is La Harpe instructing Erskine, until now, nations have only contracted political alliances, which are too often works of trickery and cunning. It is about time that they contract them for the benefit of civilization, enlightenment, and wise liberty. It is up to the heads of great nations to begin. You now know the soul of one of them. Please recall this alliance when your friend is in a position that enables him to enter into it, and prepare him for it in advance. The fact that La Harpe was actually recounting this whole scene in a letter to Alexander shows how this method both served to guide liberal opinion toward Alexander and to align Russian interests with liberal opinion, to construct Russian interests in liberal terms. La Harpe's methods were closely related to a Parisian literary enterprise affiliated with Jean-Baptiste Say and with their mutual friend, the poet Helen Maria Williams, both of whom La Harpe tried hard to recruit for Russian service. It was in Williams's Paris salon that La Harpe met Erskine and arranged many other private connections for Alexander, including a correspondence with the newly elected president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. The political expectations attached to this initially purely private connection were made explicit in a letter written to Joseph Priestley by another English radical in Paris named John Stone. "We have now," Stone wrote, "two men in the world to whom we look with mingled respect and anxiety. These two men are placed at opposite points of our globe, but their principles, their sentiments, and conduct appear to be in exact sympathy with each other. The intermediate space is filled up by chiefs of different descriptions of good and evil, tending in general, I think, toward good, but who will not go far astray when they have two sentinels such as Jefferson and Alexander to keep them in order." So these examples show why La Harpe never objected to the form of the Holy Alliance. He only criticized his former pupil for adopting a religious idiom that he considered distasteful and ineffective. For other liberals, though, that religious idiom was the perfect medium for the same kind of politics that La Harpe had practiced. After 1815, some of them went on to play the kind of role that L'Arpe had envisaged previously for himself. One of those liberals was the famous English abolitionist Thomas Clarkson, who twice met privately with Alexander in 1815 and 1818. Clarkson then circulated manuscript accounts of his meetings that were composed with as much sentimental craft as L'Arpe's letters. After exchanging religious sentiments, Clarkson and Alexander concluded another alliance. Clarkson proposed to send English teachers to help found a national system of primary education in Russia. In exchange, he sought Alexander's support in strengthening the international ban on the slave trade. And Clarkson's methods were closely related to L'Arpe's. When they met in 1818, Clarkson shared with Alexander a private letter written to him by the King of Haiti, Henri Christophe, lamenting that the threat of another French invasion was hampering his efforts to devote all his resources to the promotion of agriculture and education. Clarkson's goal was to enlist Alexander's support for his philanthropic goals, and in particular to secure Alexander's support in guaranteeing Haitian independence. In 1802, it had been Alexander's private letter that had been paraded about as testimony to the enlightenment of the monarch and the civilizing potential of his regime, and now in 1818, it was Henri Christophe's letter. At the same time, the image of Alexander as an ami des hommes, the friend of humanity, which L'Arpe had originally constructed for an audience of Thomas Jefferson's and Thomas Erskine's, was also legible to another literary virtuoso who was the architect of the Haitian Declaration of Independence and its Constitution of 1805. As Just Chanlat wrote in 1819, who knew that the same star of the North, which just shone so brilliantly over the old world, would also exert its benevolent influence over the new? Czartoryski's efforts to liberate Poland using Russian power were also born in Paris and London. They developed into two major collaborations. The first was with a Florentine exile named Scipione Piattoli, probably better known as the Abbé Morio, a character in Tolstoy's War and Peace. The second was Jeremy Bentham. Since the 1770s, long before he became known as the legislator of the world, Bentham had aspired to become the legislator of Russia, and his brother Samuel did have a remarkable career there. So both of these collaborations with Czartoryski were variations on an international process for constitutional change that amounted to a kind of federal politics. This process was defined against the imposition of a higher legal authority over European states, famously proposed by the Abbé de Saint-Pierre and other 18th century writers on perpetual peace. Instead, its starting point was an ideal closely associated with the Swiss jurist Emer de Vattel. Instead of asking what kind of legal authority had to be imposed over states, Vattel's question was, how could sovereign states legalize their external relations? What internal institutions and capacities did they require in order to learn how to align their particular interests with collective security and prosperity? By the 1780s, Vattel's approach no longer seemed sufficient for securing free trade or addressing the threat of conflict over territory in the newly independent American states as well as in Central Europe. One solution that emerged on both sides of the Atlantic was for one or more states to legislate a new treaty system for themselves, which would gradually expand to encompass other states. This approach maintained Vattel's emphasis on sovereignty, but it displaced responsibility for collective security and prosperity onto the internal constitutions and capacities of the particular state or states legislating the new treaty system. In order to apply this approach to Russia, Piattoli and Czartoryski also reinterpreted two roles often encountered in European diplomacy: the mediator of a conflict and the guarantor of the settlement that resolved it. The role of mediator had been legally formalized by Samuel Pufendorf. Unlike compulsory arbitration, mediation for Pufendorf did not violate the legal equality of states. Unlike a right to punish violations of natural law, it was a more narrowly circumscribed legal basis for external intervention in a conflict. Mediation was even endorsed by Jean-Jacques Rousseau as a procedure for restoring the constitutional balance of power within 18th century Geneva through French and Swiss intervention. The role of guarantor had acquired special significance with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, because that peace settlement also functioned as constitutional law for the Holy Roman Empire. All parties to the treaties, including France and Sweden, were assigned the right and duty as guarantors to uphold all provisions of the settlement. The result was a legal process for intervention to uphold the imperial constitution. From one perspective, the guarantee mechanism exposed the internal politics of the empire to external power politics and conflict over territory. But it also carried the potential to confine international politics within legal limits, as both Saint-Pierre and Rousseau had emphasized in their discussions of the empire's moderating effect on the European balance of power. After Russia formally took Sweden's place as guarantor of the whole Westphalian treaty system in 1779, some began to imagine that it might be capable of playing that role in a less predatory fashion than France. After Alexander came to power in 1801, Czartoryski and Piattoli explained how he could turn Russia into the mediator and guarantor not only of a new Polish constitution, but also of European politics as a whole, by engineering a definitive resolution to the endemic conflict between Britain and France. He would do so in 3 stages. First, Russia would assemble what Piattoli called the Grand Alliance of Mediation for the Pacification of Europe. After peace was achieved, this alliance would convene a post-war Congress to resolve all extant disputes among European states. But then, the third and final step would be for Alexander to solicit proposals for a new codification of international law, which all European states would then be invited to ratify. Czartoryski's collaboration with Piattoli was ended by Napoleon's victory at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, and his renewed collaboration with Bentham in 1814 produced a remarkable letter from Bentham to Alexander, a proposal for another alliance that would produce a constitution for Poland that would serve as a model not only for Russia, but for the entire world. And that plan, too, failed to materialize. But together, these plans make liberal expectations of the Holy Alliance intelligible. They show why the Holy Alliance could be seen as the next step after the Congress of Vienna, as a way for Germany and Italy to get liberal constitutions like Switzerland's, as a process that could lead to a new legal framework for Atlantic commerce, and even to a federal constitution for Europe. These plans also helped to account for what became an important strand of 19th century constitutionalism, and for the remarkable expression of it in the 1860s by the French philosopher Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Proudhon is more readily associated with anarchism, mutualism, and socialism than with the Holy Alliance. But he was a critic of Mazzini's liberal nationalism, which he considered profoundly regressive because it could not stop the relentless centralization and expansion of state power. Instead of describing the Holy Alliance as a reactionary barrier to the march of liberty, Proudhon explained why it had represented an important step for the achievement of a thoroughly decentralized federal system of mutual guarantees, which he called a plenitude of autonomies. The aim of the Holy Alliance, in Proudhon's words, had been to inaugurate the age of principles in international politics. It was nothing less than an oath to the revolution in the presence of the Holy Trinity. The idea of an age of principles may have come out of a Russian head, Proudhon claimed, but it would have done honor to Lafayette. I have no hesitation in claiming it as French. It is the application to international affairs of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Such invocations of the Holy Alliance continued to proliferate during the 20th century. The Holy Alliance was invoked most often and most colorfully by critics of the League of Nations and of Woodrow Wilson's liberal internationalism. Later, it was invoked by critics of the new global role of the United States after the 1940s. But the Holy Alliance was also invoked by advocates for new international organizations and systems of legal arbitration, by those mobilizing collective resistance to fascism, and by those envisaging reconciliation after its defeat, particularly in the form of Christian democratic politics. What all these invocations ultimately reveal is the continued absence of the definitive solution to the kinds of problems that the liberal idea of the Holy Alliance was originally supposed to address. The first scholarly history of the Holy Alliance was published in 1914 by a historian in Dublin named Walter Allison Phillips, who accused the American peace movement of aspiring to found a new Holy Alliance. The founding of the League of Nations in 1919 confirmed to Phillips that this nightmare was actually coming to pass. Phillips feared that the League would enable domestic interest groups, especially Irish Republicans, to undermine British sovereignty by using its legal structures to engage in what he called infinitely irritating guerrilla warfare. In a similar spirit, American diplomats saw the arbitration procedures proposed in the Peace Protocol of 1924 as a pretext for legal action over the racial exclusions of its immigration policy. As one American lawyer put it, Americans can learn and should learn from the Holy Alliance what the Peace Protocol may become. The superstate shall decide what is a domestic issue. During the Cold War, the Holy Alliance remained a rhetorical weapon while also becoming a tool of political analysis for mid-century liberals, particularly ones who had grappled with the complex legacy of the German jurist Carl Schmitt, like Raymond Aron. But I will conclude now with the Holy Alliance invoked by the Harvard political scientist Karl Joachim Friedrich. During the 1930s, Friedrich criticized those who approached federalism by valorizing it as a moral alternative to power politics, as he accused Woodrow Wilson of having done. However, he did not merely flip that valorization on its head, as Walter Allison Phillips had done, and as Friedrich's Harvard colleague Henry Kissinger would later do, in describing the balance of power among national states as an attractive alternative to the idealistic messianism of an Alexander or a Wilson. Instead, Friedrich focused on causal mechanisms that made federal politics work. He marveled at how Wilson had failed to draw an important lesson from the American Civil War, that the survival of a federal system depended on the agent tasked with maintaining the balance of power within it. And it depended not just on the moral authority of that agent, but on its internal coherence and capacity to act. After the Second World War, Friedrich helped the American military authorities draft the German Basic Law, making him a 20th century version of La Harpe. And in 1948, he wrote a book connecting the Kantian ideal of perpetual peace to the founding of the United Nations, making him a 20th century version of Wilhelm Traugott Krug. It was in this context that Friedrich cited a passage from Kant's famous 1795 essay on perpetual peace. If good fortune, Kant wrote, should bring it to pass that a powerful and enlightened people develops a republican form of government which by its nature is inclined toward peace, then such a republic will provide the central core for the federal union of other states. It was also in this context that Friedrich described the Holy Alliance as an attempt to implement the idea of perpetual peace by institutionalizing the guarantor of European constitutionalism, creating a coalition of states that would maintain a constitutional balance of power in Europe. The liberal idea of the Holy Alliance I've discussed today rested on intelligible but manifestly fragile claims about the so-called central core of a federal system, about the capacities and internal coherence of the agent responsible for its collective security and prosperity. It's an open question whether assessments of any of the federal systems of the present age will seem less implausible to the hindsight of future generations than initial liberal expectations of the Holy Alliance do today. At the same time, it would be precipitous to conclude from any particular crisis of any particular federal system that federalism is always and everywhere unworkable. So in the absence of definitive solutions to the kinds of problems which the liberal idea of the Holy Alliance has sought to address, expectations of their disappearance will continue to diverge from historical experience. Thank you.